Susan's on her way in and a couple of other people, but we'll get started. I'd like to introduce Dr. Arya Rosfar from the College of Education, and actually a newly appointed Learning Sciences faculty affiliate. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about Dr. Rosfar's research and then introduce him and then turn it over to him. I've asked him to talk for about 40-ish, 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions at the end. Okay? Dr. Rosfar's research interests are grounded in sociocultural theories of language learning and human development. In particular, he draws on linguistic anthropological perspectives, such as language socialization and language ideologies, for the purposes of understanding learning and development in urban schools. He teaches courses in the bilingual ESL program, as well as doctoral courses in language, literature, and culture in the College of Education. His work is anchored in communities whose language practices have been historically marginalized in many formal and official spaces of society. Thus, there's an explicit social justice character to his research. He currently serves as a PI and co-PI on several nationally funded grants aimed at improving teaching and learning for English language learners in urban contexts. So we've invited him here today. The title of this talk, "To Correct or Not Correct, Is It the Question? Metalinguistic Awareness and the Reframing of Errors in Lifelong and Life-Wide Language Learning."
Thank you, Nelson. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here, especially in this new building, the Learning Science Research Institute. It's a community that I'm really proud to be a part of, even though it's an affiliate appointment. But for the simple reason that I think having an interdisciplinary perspective and being able to cross the tensions between the disciplines, and especially along certain ideas, is very important. And I think what you'll find as you look at not only this talk, but the body of my work, not only do I draw on multiple areas, but is also, I'm learning over the last year that some people are finding this kind of rather dangerous, or threatening to like traditional linguistic approaches to learning and how we look at learners and things like that. So this is the question. I'm asking, is it the question? Because that typically is the way it's framed within second language learning, either to correct or not correct. So I'm trying to look at this issue and see whether it is the question or not. I kind of draw an analogy like, you know, when your wife or your spouse asks you something like, do you notice something different? And if you answer yes, you're wrong. And if you answer no, you're wrong. So sometimes the question itself is a trick question. So before I kind of embark on this, I'll give you a little bit of discussion about where I've been and who I think I am as a scholar. These are the communities that I've mostly participated in: the educational linguists, the learning sciences group, and also math science educators who are focused on the role of language in learning. One of the key objectives of a lot of my work is the development of critical language awareness. How people think about language from the flesh of language to what I call the heart of language. And that's where my tension with the linguistic community tends to be. So this critical awareness, which we're calling the meta-discourse of language, how do we talk about language, how do we think about language, how do we see language in the moment-to-moment interactions in the classroom, how do we move from an autonomous view of language, the flesh view of language, to a more ideological view of language, which is, you'll see what I mean by that. And when it comes to learning, looking at this on multiple scales and across the lifespan, so from early childhood all the way to adulthood, across disciplines, both in school, out of school. So these types of tensions do not lend themselves very well to a strict disciplinary approach. You know, when you're looking at learning in this way, I think you need to have a broader perspective in order to identify some key issues. So as they say, when you scratch a theory, you'll find a biography, and these are the theories that pretty much inform all of my work. The language ideologies perspective, cultural historical activity theory, and the real controversial part, which is to make a difference in the world and bring these theories into education. So how do teachers appropriate these ideas in their everyday practice? This is the key tension, because linguists tend to dislike that part, which is making their work relevant in the educational setting. They simply complain, why don't they listen to us, why don't they understand us, what's wrong with them, they can't diagram trees. So, as you see, when you step into these interdisciplinary, on these lines, you should expect to get hit a little bit. So, that's kind of where the arc of my work is. It has implications and impact on 4 key areas: STEM education, teacher education, learning and development, and also language policy, which is something I'm going to discuss. So these are my projects that I'm currently working on, looking at the impact of standard-based language policies in EL education, looking at the language attitudes, especially the language attitudes of principals with respect to African American English. That's something that's never been studied, and we're finding very interesting things. Looking at the intersection of math and language, so that's where the Math Pathways and Pitfalls project is, and the Semela work that I've been a part of. And currently I'm working on several Department of Ed grants, which looks to integrate literacy science math through action research. So teacher development, as I said before. Today I'd like to bring that discussion using data from these 2 projects. To talk about that question that we initially talked about, to correct or not correct, is it the question? The context. As you know, over the last more than a decade or so, we've seen a rather restrictive curricular environment and also a restrictive linguistic environment. And the more English learners there are in the state, the more restrictive the policy. Illinois is interesting in that we are positioned differently, in that we are one of the most pro-bilingual states in the country. So we are uniquely positioned to address this issue, but that's not so in where I originally started my work, which was California and Arizona. So, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, Common Core Standards, all these movements, and of course demographic shifts over these years. Over these years, we see that the number of ELs, English learners, is growing, the number of immigrants is growing, and this is not to be separated from the issues that we talked about before. So there's quite a disconnect between language research and practice, and that's where my action research component comes in, is to try to bridge that gap. And when we look at language and how language is thought about, so when we see, despite the shifts in demographics, the rise in ELL populations, the increase in linguistic and cultural diversity, and volumes of research supporting dynamic use of language, we see a persistent pattern of language and curricular restrictivism in educational policy. The question I'm asking, why does language remain flat? Why do we only look at the surface level of language? If I were to ask this question again, I would say, why do we only look at the flesh of language? So when we examine a language ideological approach to these questions, to the issue of language learning and literacy, we find that we can begin to talk about this complex question with an ideological approach to language and literacy. If we argue that language is critical to learning and development, then it follows that a restrictive language policy will impact learning within all domains, and it will impact all learners, not just English language learners. So my work does not have just implications for English language learners. That's just a label that's imposed upon the phenomena. So what are language ideologies? Here are some definitions. We see there are representations, the intersection of language and human beings in a social world. They are our common sense notions of what language is. Remember, the question is this: What do people think about when they think about this question, what is the nature, function, and purpose of language? That's what is the core question of a language ideological approach. When they hear that question, what do they think of? Do they think of grammar? Do they think of grammatical conjugations? Do they think of structure? Do they think of meaning? Do they think about ideologies? What do they think about when they think about that question, the nature, function, purpose of language? How do they rationalize that, as Silverstein talks about? How are these ideas self-evident to them, common sense notions? How does that compare to what we know about actual language practices across multiple contexts and communities? And finally, how do we examine the moral and political interests that are embedded in those discussions of language? So the concept of ideology is not confined merely to ideas or beliefs, but rather is extended to include the very language practices through which our ideas or notions are enacted. So how we display our language use is our language ideology. Whatever people do, that's their belief. If we elicit the belief and discuss the beliefs in a different context, that's a different activity. That's a meta-awareness of the language. That's not necessarily the language ideology itself. So the core theoretical and methodological questions are these. What is the nature, function, and purpose of language? What is the nature, function, and purpose of language in learning? And 3, how are answers to these questions made explicit in everyday language use, looking at code, performance, the semiotics, and ideology. So let's kind of go through the process. So when we talk about questions like what and whose standard, for example, so you have this tension, right, between standard English as this kind of innocuous language used by no one that sits out there in this amorphous space. No ethnicity, no people, no community, just standard. Then you have its opposition, which is the local varieties. And here we have a cartoon from the late 90s during the heat of the Ebonics debate in California. When they were saying if we accept Ebonics, then we will have to start to accept all these other varieties too, like Cajunonics, Redneckonics, Minnesotanonics, Valley Girlonics, New Jersey-nonics, Jivonics. So it's basically saying if you open the door of diversity, then it's going to be a threat to the standard. So this is the tension, standard or variety. Standard learning or variation in learning. And that's why we see that this relationship is not a symmetrical one, it's an asymmetrical one. And this perspective of language allows us to see these tensions. Right? The tension between the so-called standard and its invisible speakers, and the dialect speakers and its very visible speakers. The debate about Spanglish. This is the same part of the same idea. We see how the discussion of language itself is a neutral turf for ideological contestation. We can discuss language separate from all those other things because language itself is neutral. So that's why Gingrich could say something like, bilingual classes teach ghetto language. Because language is separate from identity, separate from ideology, so it's okay to frame your positions through language as a neutral phenomenon. And same thing, remember in the last campaign when Obama talked about that we should all learn Spanish, that was a big controversial topic, a controversial position that was for which he was attacked. So more of the same, race to the top. Racing to the top, we're becoming more standardized, we're becoming more homogeneous. Not only are we standardized and homogeneous about language, but we're also standardized and homogeneous about learning. So these two is what's constituting our race to the top of a sinking ship. The more homogeneous we become in how we think about language, the more homogeneous we become in terms of how we think about learning, then we end up and we see that this battle is also being played out in mathematics when it comes to the role of language or the defense of pure math. So these debates about literacy and numeracy are not to be separated. And Libby Green raises an interesting question. She talks about how when we see things like English only or standard language, we don't have the same moral reaction as when we see something like colored only, or when we see something like for women only. You see how all these different ideas evoke different reactions. And that's an indication of kind of our ideological positioning with respect to those ideas. Do we see identity and language as inextricably linked, or do we see them as separate? Let's add this. Let's look at standards. Are all standards equal? The standard metaphor. What if we talked about standard shoe? That everybody had to wear the same shoe. Or standard shirt. Everybody had to fit in the same shirt. Standard pants, standard height, standard weight, standard car, standard healthcare. This is ridiculous, right? Well, maybe not healthcare. I don't know. Obamacare. So, the way we talk about standards is not always the same. Sometimes standards are okay, sometimes standards are not okay. Sometimes standards means homogeneity, sometimes it's not. But now, add these three to the list. Standard mind, standard language, and standard learner. Meaning we all learn the same, we all learn the same way, we all have the same mind, and we all have the same language. Now it starts to seem a little ridiculous, right? But this is the national discourse surrounding language and learning, right? We're standardizing curriculum and we're standardizing language. But we would never dare think about standardizing our clothes or other physical types of markers of sovereignty and individuality. But when it comes to the most complex part of who we are, which is our language and our learning, we want to make it all fit the same size shoe. And this is a tension that's not just a tension, this is a tension that can become a travesty in how we organize learning in schools and in non-school settings. So Silverstein offers us a kind of a comparison. We have a monoglot standard that wants to make everything the same. And then we have a pluriglot standard. And I offer you these two images as a way to think about the issue. What are the costs? What are the benefits of each? So you have Walmart on one side, cheap prices, cheap products, exploitation of workers, right? Access, economy of scale. There's a lot of benefits to a Walmart. What do you get with a mom and pop shop? You get sovereignty, you get variety, maybe the products are a little more expensive, but you have much more control. You have much more independence. So this is the philosophical tension right now. This is the philosophical tension, this is the ideological tension that we are in when we look at the nature, function, and purpose of language and learning. Are we all going to fit in the same shoe? Or do we all have different shoes? If we all had, I remember watching a video, and it was a YouTube video about Usain Bolt and the standard shoe. Have you seen that video? Oh, it's a great video. He said, what if we had a standard shoe? Usain Bolt would never be able to fit in it, and he would never be able to run. And we would never know that he has the talent to run and win the Olympic gold and all this kind of stuff. So, the learning and language is much more complex than any of these other things that we would instantly reject the notion of standards for, because of the nature of the human mind and the nature of language itself. So this is what Silverstein, who is at the University of Chicago and actually works with one of my students on his dissertation, offers this critique of the narrow, the flat view of language, the fleshy view of language, and the flat view of learning, basically. says, such wide-eyed innocence, perhaps coming from the referentialist structuralist dogma about what is really at stake for the groups concerned with language in relation to a culture of monoglot standardization, embarrasses me and makes me realize that perhaps my high school math teacher was right when he said the language is too important to be left to the linguists. And this is why I think the linguists are a little bit agitated by the approach to language that I think we're offering today. So this is our approach. 4 questions that have to be asked about language when you think about that first question. What is the nature, function, and purpose of language? Most linguists just stay at number 1, flat. What is said? But as you will see, there's 3 other components when it comes to how language actually works and how language mediates learning. How is it said? What is meant? And what are the underlying values, histories, in short, ideologies surrounding those uses? How is it being framed? So in all my work with teachers, I'm trying to move them to think about language like this in their moment-to-moment lives in schools. And the articles that you might have looked at are kind of each of them represents one angle of that. And these 2 questions I feel are perhaps the most important. Meaning. This is where I mentioned in terms of the heart of language. Moving beyond the flesh of language and moving towards the heart of language. So an ideological approach to language necessarily asks all 4 questions, whereas an autonomous only asks the first. And I borrow Ray McDermott's assumption about learning and learners and what they say when he says, everybody makes sense all the time. What does that mean in a special ed class? What does that mean in an ELL class? What does that mean in a so-called mainstream class? When you go in with the assumption that everybody makes sense all the time. In activities designed for instruction and learning, the rubber meets the road in error correction. So now we're back to the original question. How do we see language ideology play out in classrooms and in organized learning activities is by looking at corrective practices. When is it being done? How is it being done? And what's being targeted in that act of correction? And I'm combining 2 ideas. Repair from conversation analysis and corrective feedback from second language acquisition. I know it's blasphemous, but I did it. Because corrective feedback is supposed to stay only in this SLA group, and repair is only supposed to stay in the conversation analysis group. And if you dare bring them together, then you violated the disciplinary rule, the guardians. Of oral and written symbolic exchanges. So here's some examples. What to do. Do you correct or not correct? Now, the articles you read, most of the time when the teachers read it, the first thing they do is they come to me with like a confessional. They either think they shouldn't correct or they do correct. So here's some examples. We is versus we are. Acts versus ask. Finna versus gonna versus going to. Twice as less versus twice as much. That's a mathematics example. And these are all using the first line of analysis. The first reaction is that these are all incorrect. If we just looked at code and standards and all that, we would say these are all incorrect. When you look at the research, that's how it boils down. We call it the corrective feedback wars in second language acquisition. There's one group that comes strongly in favor. They say, look, when you correct, it develops metalinguistic awareness. It increases the learner's perception. It improves recall. Then you have the other group that says when you correct, it stigmatizes, there's no positive effect, and may even be harmful. This is the polarization of the discussion. Now, if you're any of your parents, you probably have corrected your kids once or twice. Do you feel guilty about it? As teachers, we do that all the time. So why would the discussion look like this? Why is it polarized like this? This is the history of the whole language debate. The whole language people were on this against camp, and the phonics people are in the favor camp. So I kind of moved out of the camp a little bit and looked for a third option. I said, you know what? It's not really about the actual act of correcting. To isolate it to the act of correcting is to remove the context of the correction and how the participants are interpreting it. How are the participants making sense of this act of correction? Are they feeling the stigma? Are they feeling the sting? Where is it coming from? What is the ideological framing of this act? So I believe that we need to move into this third option to look at corrective feedback and repair, not so much from the act, but the cultural and ideological context in which it's taking place. With these principles in mind: social justice, equity, the issue of solidarity between the student and the teacher, or the mom and the kid, and looking at sociocultural tenets of language. So once you apply these three: student agency, sociocultural tenets of language, and social justice, now you start to broaden the discussion. You're not looking at individual acts and trying to determine whether they're effective or not, or how it impacts language learning or impacts learning, period. You're trying to look at the relationship and what it entails for the learner and the learnee. So, when you look at repair from a CA perspective, it's the language practice of either correcting either one's own speech or the speech of another. Traditionally, it's very neutral. It's meant to look at just how do interlocutors maintain conversational equilibrium. Looking at self-repair and other repair. So, when I looked at it as a language ideological practice, I looked at it as that whenever someone initiates an act of repair, it must be grounded in some notion of correctness. Where is that correctness located? Is it an invisible community? Or is it located within a particular socially organized community with rules, ideologies, values, beliefs, goals, all those kinds of things that are the hallmarks of a sociocultural activity system? This practice can be used to construct differences in status, especially with respect to knowledge and authority. And I have 3 case examples from the different work that I've done. Mr. Standers, who's an experienced high school sheltered English teacher. Mr. Ramirez, who's an experienced elementary 2nd grade bilingual ESL teacher. And Ms. Rodriguez, who's a novice elementary 4th, 5th grade mathematics ELL teacher. So these last two are at the same school. Ms. Ramirez served as a mentor teacher for Ms. Rodriguez, and they're actually located in the Midwest. The first one is from the Southwest. So let me show you this video so you kind of get a sense of the topic and the issues involved. Can you see that?
Yeah, so that number one, you get perspective. When did this person live? Okay? If they lived in the 1800s, you're dealing with a different world, different principles, different ideals. Alright? If you're reading something like this by a woman named Anne Beattie, she's still alive. She was born in 1947, so she's an old man. 100. Yeah, two simple math. It's 2,000. Subtract 47 off 2,000. What you get? Ain't a math class? Tell me what class it is. Okay, so then try and speak in English the right way. Not ain't. This what? Isn't, right? Isn't the math class. Alright, so
what we see in this example is all of the things that we talked about. Ideologies of language, ideologies of the disciplines, and even ideologies of learning, purist language ideologies. You have a structuralist language ideology. And then there's the issue of student agency and resistance. You have how the learning is organized. You have classroom management at play. So all of the issues this is one of the nuggets of my work. So all of the issues that I've been talking about came to play within this one interaction. And so you see that there are multiple student responses. It's an English class, so it's a math question. And that is, the student invokes that ideology as a way of resisting the question, because perhaps the student sees that the teacher is trying to maybe stigmatize her or make her look bad in front of the other students. And so you have this kind of tension between the two. So this ain't a math class, this ain't a math class. Tell me what class it is. English. Okay then, try to speak English the right way, not ain't. This what? So this issue of ain't is, so we know this is not about the math question, right? It looks like a math question, but it's not a math question. And this is why you have to go beyond the flesh, beyond the flatness of the language, and go beyond the literal. Talking about ain't, what is the implication of this ain't? What does it mean? Is it the issue that the teacher didn't know what she was saying? Of course not. It's that it was an inappropriate form in an inappropriate place, and it was a way to regulate classroom interaction. So we see ain't as a very controversial term throughout history. Beginning in 1941, and these are all reflections coming from teachers. So when we talk about this, so that example, imagine that example being provided to teachers, and these are the examples that they gave back to me. I wasn't aware of this one. This was long before I was born. So one student at that time said that Dizzy Dean's use of ain't during the 1941 World Series was a very controversial issue. So his disregard for correct grammar caught the attention of the St. Louis Board of Education, and they demanded that he be taken off the air. And his response was, let the teachers teach English, and I will teach baseball. As for his use of ain't, he said there is a lot of people in the United States who say isn't, and they ain't eating. Again, resistance. So you see that here's the intersection between language form and language use. And that's what's great about the language ideological perspective, that it locates macro ideas within the very lowest micro level of interaction. So this discussion of ain't is not just a discussion of form, it's a discussion of function, it's a discussion of ideology, it's a discussion of meaning, right? It's a discussion of status, solidarity, all these kinds of things. So another critic asked if he knew the King's English. He answered, yes, I do, and I know the Queen's English too. Bill Cosby, equating ain't with bad parenting. They can't speak English. I can't even talk the way these people talk. Why you ain't? Where you is? And I blamed the kid until I heard the mother talk. And then I heard the father talk. Everybody knows it's important to speak English except these knuckleheads. You can't be a doctor with that kind of crap coming out of your mouth. So what is it about ain't that evokes such powerful ideological stances? We know what it means, so it's not the issue of meaning. If language's primary purpose is to communicate and make meaning, why would it generate such evocative stances? Lisa Delpit talks about a student who was repaired by a teacher. She says, but she ain't make no sense. And the teacher looks at her and says, yeah, but she doesn't make any sense. Revoicing, remodeling, the liberal way of correcting, right? Not hurting the feeling of the child too much. But then the child responds back and says, yeah, but she ain't made no sense. For the linguists out there, this is saying that these two are not the same. You cannot translate. What she's saying is different. It's a different degree of emphasis. She ain't make no sense is showing much more powerful negation than what she doesn't make any sense is. Many languages do this. African American English does it. It's a different function, it's a different purpose, it's a different nature, it's a different context, it's a different history. So to correct that with an equivalent standard is actually incorrect, because they're not the same. It's coming from a whole different etymological, historical position. And this child was aware of that. She didn't succumb to, she doesn't make any sense. She says she ain't make no sense. It's different than that. Here's another reaction from a teacher. I never thought what Delpit, Morgan, and Mold talked about was relevant until today. As she was writing on the chalkboard, Natasha went and tugged on her shirt and said, "Teacher, I like go pee-pee." Miss R turned around and angrily said, "What did you say?" "I like go pee-pee." Some giggling in the background. "You will go nowhere, young lady, until you ask me in proper English. Now say it properly." "I know can." "Then you can just stand there until you do." Natasha just stood there as others continued to laugh, and Miss R continued the lesson. A few minutes later, the occasional giggle exploded in a chorus of laughing. As Miss R turned to the child was sobbing as she stood in the middle of the large puddle of urine on the classroom floor. Correction is a serious act. So, to correct or not correct, this is a type of symbolic violence, if you will, that's being committed. So, to think of correction as a neutral practice is a travesty. Now, you might think, well, these are exceptional cases, or these are very extreme cases. But they bring into light the fundamental ideological issue of language. Language spans all four gamuts. That we must never look at language practices simply as practices that are devoid of communities and devoid of beliefs and values and relationships, of solidarity and distance. Here's another one. A teacher reflecting upon, this is what I wrote about in an article. Miss Rodriguez shouts David from across the classroom, "You finna give us our ice cream party on Friday?" My students are promised a monthly party as a solution towards rewarding and promoting students who exhibit positive behavior in the classroom. I turn towards David and respond, "You mean, are we going to have our ice cream party on Friday?" It was a norm in my classroom to answer to my students in standard English and to have them respond back using standard English as a form of correction. Hence, I became alarmed when David challenged this norm by standing out of his chair, throwing his hands up in the air, and exclaiming, "Why you be always trying to make us be a white dude?" My eyebrows raised up perplexed, and my mouth dropped speechless and bewildered at his words. I wasn't always trying to make him be white. What did he even mean by this statement? Was he associating standard English to being white? I'm an Asian American who speaks standard English, yet I don't think I'm white, and David's skin color is black. So how can he possibly think I would want him to be white, or that I even had a choice in the matter? The question of race confused me. You can't change your skin color, and so what does it even mean to be a white dude? To imply that I always do this made me reflect on my own everyday language practices in the classroom. What am I always doing to reinforce David's interpretation of whiteness? What bothered me the most out of his sentence was him phrasing that I'm making him into something that he's not, white. This is repair. This is teachers talking repair. So based on all that, I started to look at not just the act of repair, but the context of repair. And tried to see, well, what does repair look like in a classroom where the teacher and the students have a relationship that we're calling confianza, or solidarity, or in line with the language practices, cultures, and communities in which those students are using. How is it built? Beyond the surface and aesthetic level of caring, how do we establish that we are with each other throughout our instructional practice? How do we show reciprocal relations of solidarity? So this comes from my project Impact with Ms. Ramirez, right here in Chicago. In a time when, as you know, now it's actually worse, so this was a few years back, where standards and all these discussions are coming into the classroom. We looked at her class over a one-year period. We did interviews with her. We looked at particular activities during the literacy block that were organized around themes. We did coding of this data. And this is what we found. We found for the first 3 months, which is September, October, November, and well, almost 4 months, this is what she says. I'll do an introduction to English, but during this time, I'm making sure they have literacy skills in their native language. And I'm also helping them to develop their higher order thinking in their native language. I cannot wait until they learn English to push them to start thinking critically. So they're doing that in their native language now, and when January comes, I have confidence that they will have acquired enough English to start taking risks and using those skills in their second language. Here we have an example during author's chair where Jorge totally misses, not totally, but somewhat, misses the author's ideas. Miss R, Jorge, léelo por favor. Jorge, read it please. This is Jorge's response. Este cuento me recuerda que yo también planté una semilla de manzana y ha nacido un ramito y todavía yo lo tengo en la ventana, pero necesita el sol. También yo planté una semilla de girasol y una de calabaza. This story reminds me that I also planted an apple seed, and a bunch grew, and I still have it in the window, but it needs sun. I also planted a sunflower seed and a pumpkin. So basically, Jorge here has not summarized what the author talked about. He just spoke about his own experience. So look at how Miss R corrects. Says, muy bien, ¿qué opina de lo que escribió Jorge? She turns it back to the peers. She says, very good, what do you think about what Jorge wrote? Miguel answers, and because of time I'll read just the English, that he wrote the author's ideas, but some ideas. He used, so Miss R takes this up, she goes, he used, wait dear, one at a time. Miguel, what would you say? They are the author's ideas and Jorge's? And he used his own ideas. Very good, thank you. Oscar, what would you like to say? He almost did the author's ideas. So look at how this is expanded and elaborated and distributed within the class. Multiple expertise, multiple learners, multiple relationships being invoked. Okay, the author's ideas. So you would recommend to Jorge that he tell us more about what the author would say in the book. So the teacher is projecting her correction through the voice of another student. Like how many apples grew, something like. So then Ms. R concludes, you want more details about what the book says. Okay, we're going to listen to, thank you, Jorge, I like what you wrote. So this is an example of the kind of culture and how Ms. R organized learning in this class around, and how she provided corrective feedback. Corrective feedback is not something to be avoided at all. It is very critical to learning. It's a key mediational tool. It does develop metalinguistics, and metalinguistic awareness is key to learning and regulation and all those things. Another thing she did was she used affective practices to build a sense of I'm with you, which is very difficult to translate. especially in primary discourse. She used a lot of terms like mi amor, corazón, niños, mamita, and here's kind of our count of it. These were ways in which she created a homely environment with the children in this class. As you can see, these are not words that you can translate into English. My love is not exactly the same as mi amor in that context. Perhaps my dear one is a little bit closer. And the use of children is less formal than like using students. So these are another way in which that solidarity is established. These are subtle techniques, but this is what she was doing. And this is the final example of how she corrects to avoid that issue of stigmatization that we talked about in the beginning, that people are so concerned about. Because correction is a loaded practice if that relationship is not on firm ground. When you know somebody is with you and they correct you, you interpret that as an act of love. If you think that person is not with you and they correct you, you look at that as an act of oppression. This is the fundamental tension. It's the same act, interpreted in two opposing ways. You could probably see that in your own life, right? So here she speaks with the student. My love, what you gotta do, what we do is that this will be our secret. This is how she frames. This guess attempt we will know because we only work together but the other. So she's already creating a context for the feedback of writing. So no one's gonna know about this. You could take risks, right? Because taking risks is a very critical part of learning. Without risk-taking, there's no learning. And fostering that environment of risk-taking is essential to this. So here you see that she's done that. This sheet where we will organize our ideas, this paper, then it will not show to anyone. So she's establishing that this is our secret. This is only now as we organize our ideas. There's no consequences. It's not permanent. What we're going to do is show the class the page that is the riddle. So that's how those were the kind of practices that we saw regularly over the year. And Ms. Rodriguez was one of the most effective teachers of English learners in that school. So this is why we picked her to see what she's actually doing, especially in relation to correction and repair. So we, in the same school, developed another project in collaboration with West Ed, where the goal of the project is to generate discussion around mathematical problem solving, especially around the idea of errors and errors and strategy, normalizing the act of making errors. So errors are not seen as something bad, but something positive. And this is what we call the meta-discourse of the pitfall meta-discourse. So talking about pitfalls. So the significance of errors in English language learning and the reframing of errors and pitfalls is significant because of the negative consequence of error correction that we kind of showed before. And the pitfall narrative provides a new rationale for errors by making it a normative practice of the classroom ecology. Pitfalls are to be expected without negative stigma on the learner, and it engenders a risk-taking and metalinguistic awareness. This is why having a very explicit activity that normalizes the culture of error and risk-taking is so critical. So within this activity system, and I know you saw this in the article, so I'm not going to go through it, but you see that this is how the system kind of is organized to, with the goal of socializing kids into certain kinds of problem-solving strategies with respect to sums and differences and even fractions. Oops, sorry. So, I don't know. So I'll just leave it like that. So you can see there's multiple arrangements: whole class, small group, partner, individual, public presentation of thoughts. Remember, the goal of the activity is to discussion, talking mathematics, doing mathematics. doing mathematics in multiple languages. And we saw that in the various moments of the class. Role shifts, expert novice role shifts, assistance from peers. Then we offered these as mediational tools, the discussion builders. Not necessarily the form, but the function of it. And of course, in the beginning, teachers always wanted to adhere to the form, which is normal in the learning process, sticking to the form, sticking to the scaffold. And these are some examples of that. Here's the narrative itself, where you have an okay strategy, and then you have the pitfall strategy. These are modeled. And as you can see, the pitfalls always kind of make sense, right? It's not like an error that doesn't make sense. It's just the way the child is interacting with the problem. And this speaks to the broader topic in sociocultural theory about how we learn, period. That learning is fundamentally a shift in the ratio, from going from form and giving prevalence to function and meaning. So that's something that we looked at, how the teacher actually learned to go beyond the form of the discussion builder stems. So I think I'm going to stop right here because I want to leave some time for questions and answers and discussion. So is that okay? Or you said?
I don't know how much longer you think.
Well, I was going to conclude,
Yeah,
wrap it up a
okay.
little bit if that. Okay, so let me skip through then the pitfall. This is kind of the last thing. So we talked about that. So I want to get back to the original question, to correct or not correct, is it the question? We is versus we are. I had a teacher in a class that was very adamant about correcting the student. He said, no, it is we is. For 6 weeks, we kept going back and forth. It was very tough for me, but I stuck with it. And finally I said, you know, why don't you ask the kid and see what do they mean by we is? What does he think? And this is the answer she got, which was very riveting for me. Because not only was it correct grammatically, but it was also, it was actually correct ideologically from the point of view of the child. So actually the teacher, in initiating that correction, was making an ideological or sociocultural error. Because the child saw this notion of collective as being one. Like family. Like this one collective ethos. Right? So that just points to the critical issue of getting into the worldview of a language practice. And resisting the temptation to stay grounded in our own restrictive, autonomous, narrow view of language learning and the learner who are participating in that. So I moved from a meta-discourse to meta-discourse, which means the Buddhist term referring to loving kindness, friendliness, benevolence, and active interest in others. That when that's there, then we understand that the discussion about language is not just about language form, it's about relationships. And that so much of what we do in learning is so reliant on language that we have to talk about language. And we have to have the tools to talk about language at the 4 levels that I mentioned. Talking about the code of the language, talking about the prosody of the language, talking about the semiotics of the language, and finally talking about the ideologies of the language. And that is how we build solidarity and confianza with students. And when that is the meta-discourse, then it doesn't matter if you're correct or not correct. Because that becomes the frame of the correction, right? The relationship. That is what I think is the most critical point. Final thoughts. This type of discussion arouses a critical awareness of critical language ideologies. It allows us to focus on the context of corrective feedback and repair as opposed to the act of corrective feedback and repair. It comes from a position looking at affect, solidarity, and confianza. And when we look at that question, to correct or not correct, if that's the question that is aroused from looking at these acts of correction, I believe it's the right reaction, but it's the wrong question. Because the reaction is a moral one, an ethical one, but the response is not the correction to correct or not correct, but to change the context in which that correction is taking place. And with that, I'll conclude.
We can then open it up for questions and discussion.
Yes.
What was the age range of a lot of students? Because I saw there was a wide variety. For instance, a lot of the students who had, for instance, the affectionate terms that the teacher gave to them.
They were elementary. Yeah, that was an elementary class. So 4th grade, I believe. It was a 4th grade class.
Do you think that would have changed? Would they still use the same, would the teachers still have used the same terminology if it was, say, like middle school or high school?
I don't know. It's an empirical question.
Because in one of your papers you also mentioned that the parents would often say, like, you know, listen to your teacher.
Well, let me just answer the question a little bit more broadly. What I think is, when I look at those, this is the tendency. The last thing I like people to do is to say, okay, so if we just do these mi amors and then everything's going to be all right. No. This is what she did. That's what worked for her. What works for you might be totally different. But as long as you know that the goal is building that confianza, right? Mm-hmm. You might do it differently. You know, you might have to do it through talking about sports, or you might have to do it through, the goal is to build the confianza, not necessarily mimic the practices. So every case, I think, is going to be different. And that's something that I'm very clear about in the way I talk about this. When we're talking about, when we focus on the context of development, we don't want to, if we start picking and bringing it over exactly as it is, we've missed the whole boat. Right? Because each relationship is a unique one. Each situation is a unique one. So if through these discussions, I understand that's my goal. Now I look for the practices that are relevant within my own context. I could get some ideas from other places, but you yourself probably have a rich reservoir of creating these relationships. So draw on that and get to know your students' communities and how they do that, and start to engage in those practices that build that type of confiance. In an article that we're working on right now, sometimes it's the sharing of a common issue. Like, for example, in the Southwest, discussing the prohibido sign that's on the San Diego border. You know, that's a very, sometimes some teachers want to avoid that issue, but that's an issue the kids care about. So sometimes just discussing the issue lets them know that you're with them. You're on the same topic, and that builds that solidarity, confianza. So, like, for example, sometimes using the accent is a very good practice. But if you are the wrong person using that accent, it will actually have the opposite effect. It will be looked at as a patronizing act. So this is a very critical moment, critical issue, to not imitate the practices or think that it necessarily transfers in the traditional way, like a toolbox, into other situations, because each situation is different and each relationship is different. But the goal is the same. The goal is, I think the goal is what doesn't change, which is the confianza, the solidarity, and creating that kind of environment where the kids will feel like you're with them, and so we get out of that reaction of should I correct or not correct, right? Because the correction itself is it's one of the basic and the most important mediational forms that we do in instruction to provide assistance to learners. So we can never say don't correct. Like, I remember when I was a baseball player, I couldn't hit a curveball, and I kept trying, I couldn't do it. Finally, my friend said, hey, you know what? You gotta look at the pitch before it's thrown. I said, what? You gotta determine it's a pitch. So I was looking for the pitch after it was thrown. That was my intuitive way of hitting. He says, start looking at it when it's thrown. Now I'm starting to hit the ball. It gave me that split second extra that I needed to hit it. And you could apply that. You need explicit instruction. You need that direct instruction. You need sometimes to become aware of a strategy that will help you within a task. So sometimes I think that's why in the language learning community, it's always polarized. Some people don't correct anything, and some people correct everything. And I'm thinking the offshoot of this discussion is that there needs to be a discussion about how language works. Teachers and students need to talk about language itself, the nature of language, and how it's working in their lives, and then you learn how you can build that solid. I think that discussion itself is what builds that confianza. Like, so what do you mean? How do you do things? Like that.
So, one of the things that underlies a lot of the issues around how one moves kids forward, not just in language, but in other areas, is how you regard what they bring to the table. And whether or not that's respected as genuine intellectual kind of presence, or whether you're making the assumption that your role is to kind of excise everything that isn't sort of the standard way and replace it. And so, it leads to the pour-in model versus the build-on model in a sense. But you can't, I think one of the issues here is you can't build on what a kid brings if you have no respect for it. And if you have no respect for what they're thinking or how they're saying what they're thinking, that gets communicated in the way you approach the sort of moving them forward.
Yes.
Right? So, when you asked about the terms of those kinds of terms of endearment that are used with little kids, well, when you move into older kids, what's the sort of grounds for people believing that you respect them, right? And it's kind of some of those, that's sort of the deeper underlying principles that we often see people pick up the surface strategies. It's
Right.
kind of picking up the flesh of the language without
And that's what happened.
understanding
That's what
behind
happened
that.
during when they were doing cultural responsive teaching, and they were starting to teach African American English in the class, and the African American kids were like, kind of like it was awkward to them, So sometimes we do pick up the flesh, and we miss the message, the underlying goal, and I think that's very true.
I was a bit surprised at the beginning of your presentation when you presented the standardized English dictionary, and maybe I misunderstood you, but you said that it was void of a community. Yet when you went to the other standardizations of languages, whether Ebonics, Spanglish, etc., they had a community of practice, and my surprise is that void of standard English almost presents standard English as an ethic, that it's got, where does it come from? You can't question where it comes from.
I meant to say it ironically.
Oh, okay.
No language is without a community.
Uh-huh.
And that's why in my article I tend to not use the word standard English. I try to give it a community and say this is white English, or this is whatever like the kids are reacting to it. You saw like in that example with the teacher.
Sorry, I missed your irony.
And I'm sorry. I was using an ironic tone, and I probably should have. I thought it was clear, but no language. When you take an ideological view of language, there's no such thing as a community-less language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's an imaginary figment of a linguist's imagination. And that's the whole field is based on that. If you look at linguistics as a field, it's not based on actual language use. And that's why they kind of are always at war with like this kind of perspective, the linguistic wars. Because all their data is whatever they logically imagine could be possible to say. And I think you're very much right on that, in that dictionary does have a community, it has a history It has a heavy-handed history. You know, it's not like that's why when the dictionary got big, I was trying to like show that like this is not like something that is innocuous or doesn't. So when we say standard, we're making it invisible. That's the point I was trying to make. The use of the word standard is making it humanless, communityless, right? But if I call it like white English or white middle class English or Midwest English, now see if I do that with African American English is okay, right? But with standard English, we're not supposed to give it a community because all of a sudden something becomes visible, right? And that's why we use the term standard English very comfortably, but we're not naming a community. And of course it has a community. What should we call it? I don't know. I mean, I know what some communities call it, so I use that term, but I think at least when you call it something, it at least gives it a human face, or makes it human, brings up the issue, and at least brings the tension into visibility. And I think that's what I meant to say.
So in classrooms where the teachers and students have built up this sort of solidarity among them, were there instances where you saw it break down at all? Like were there repairs that the teacher would make that would be, you know, too much or something like that?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a trial and error, and that's why you had the different range. You had the secret, nuestro secreto. You had some that were a little more open, and sometimes you just kind of have to test those boundaries, and you never know ahead of time. There's not a quick, fast rule like, okay, you should always do it in secret, or you should always do it in public. Like for me, if I was correct in public, nothing happens to me. You know, I'll just fight back or something, or you know, like that's. But some other student might not. It might crush them. You know, it might. So there's no hard, fast rule for that. We're always in meaning making. We're always approximating. We don't know ahead of time what works with each person. So you're figuring it out. It's a negotiation, if you will. So I know that's not the answer you probably want to hear, but I'm sorry, but that's how I think it is. Because usually teachers, they might want you to give them like, give me something that works every time. I said, well, you just think about language and how language works, and you will be able to decide yourself. You know, it's like any relationship, right? Sometimes you go too far. Well, what do you got to do? You got to reconcile. You got to fix it up. It's like with when I teach teachers about third space. Sometimes it goes so far the students don't even want to talk with each other anymore. Like so, you can't teach to create a third space without also providing them necessary mediational tools that'll help them get through a tension. So you want to create a tension, but you don't want it to break. Right? It's like a bend but not break kind of approach to learning. How do we bend it so that we could? It's like lifting weights or something. Sometimes you lift too much and you're out for a few weeks. You know. So how do you know your limit? Trial and error, right?
I was wondering if you had thought about or have looked at progressions of teacher practice, like if someone, a pre-service teachers or someone that's been in service now, that's kind of coming around to your idea of we need to establish this culture of confianza and how their practices are changing as they're trying to incorporate that.
I'm starting to do that, and we just finished, over the last 5 years, the teachers that we worked with through the different projects, we're actually starting to write about how they took these ideas and how long it took them and how they made sense of them and how that process looked like. And we have different cases, not surprisingly. Some of the, and it followed the sociocultural process, really. But what we see is that with these teachers, what we're learning is that it took almost 2 years for them to really become comfortable with the idea of discourse analysis, and looking at language in this very complex way. And it took a lot of investment from us, like working with the graduate student, designing units that were organized around these principles, and then spending 1 month reflecting on that, and then making adjustments, and then going back, and then after that period was over, doing it again. So if I were to present on that project, you would see how these teachers, after 2.5 years, finally start to be able to teach like a third space kind of curriculum, think about corrective practices, and sometimes they have in the beginning they realize how much control they have over the instruction. So letting go, it becomes like an issue that they discuss, teacher authority. And the goal of the program is so that teachers become researchers, right? Using these discursive methods and making it their own so that they can identify the issues in their classrooms. Because the last thing we want is to give them like a list of practices. What we'd like to give them is a list of ideas and principles, and to be able to identify those issues in the class and organize learning through that. But I think it takes a lot, from what we did, it took at least 2.5 years working with teachers to finally get this four dimensions of language down. Because, as I said, it's much more intuitive to think about language as flat. Just like it's just intuitive to think about the earth as flat. You need to step out of it to see that it's not flat. And that's what a theory does. When you're armed with a theory, when you're armed with a method, then now you can step outside that tendency to go with your intuition. Because our intuition is very synchronic. We stay in the moment. But when you step out and reflect, that's why the meta-discourse is so important. Meta-discourse is that stepping outside and reflecting about the practices that are unfolding before you. And that takes time. It's trial and error. It takes time. It's varied. It's not always the same. It's a struggle. We say these things. It's a tension filled, Sometimes it goes too far. You got to make amends. Sometimes you don't go enough. I mean, that's the reality of it. So, I know most curriculum want to be really nice packaged, and that's the Walmart curriculum. I'm advocating for a mom and pop curriculum. Really, I mean, if I want to make it simple, I believe there's better. It's a better positioning of the teacher. So when you put that in the context of how we see teachers and the deprofessionalization of teachers and the disrespect for teachers, that's the Walmart model. Now we have examples in our case of teachers being able to do this even in a very restrictive environment. How did they make the restrictive curriculum into these type of learning goals? You can do it. It's possible. It's getting harder, but it's still possible. Eventually we're going to have to move out and create a new school, new mom and pop shop or something.
Have you looked at all at how this might work in written language? Correction in
Yeah, one of the
writing?
examples I showed you was written. I have not done that as much, but from the project in Project Impact, there was a lot of writing where we looked at that. But most of my work on repair so far has been in actual discourse.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel that certain things break down, they need to change, or
But the same,
do the same general principles?
yeah, I mean, it's the same tension between focus on form or focus on meaning. Again, I think the same thing applies. The solidarity, this explicit discussion of what this genre writing is, right? What's the goal here? This is, a very explicit discussion about the audience, all those things that have to do with writing. That's part of meta discourse, I believe.
So I think there's one difference, an important difference, between oral language and written language. And that is that people acquire their first oral language by being in the context of others who are using the language. And there's no real formal teaching of it or anything, but that oral language is always different from what that language looks like when it's written down. There's a much more formal set of features about written language that everybody has to learn. And so I think there are some differences between correcting kids' talk and providing models of what formal language that's written down or that written language looks like.
And I think that that's where my question was going, in that, I mean, how do you make that distinction between, and also writing is a little bit much more individualistic, so it can become a little less communal in practice, and so how does the person who's doing the correcting try to differentiate, read the mind of the writer, so to speak, since they don't have the moment-to-moment discourse to take cues from?
So I think David Olson has some really nice pieces on some of the differences between the features of oral language and the features of written language. You're asking a really complicated question, because this degree of translation or difference, I mean, you know, you take your own oral language, anyone in this room could take their own oral language and just get a transcript of it, and it's virtually incomprehensible when you try to read it. So you're always translating when you try and put something on paper, and it's because of the fact that you're not there to make repairs in a conversation. If you see that someone isn't getting it, then you rephrase, you restate it, you go back, whatever. That you have to imagine yourself with you're absent. So how do you say things in a way that are going to be as clear as possible to someone who's going to read this when you're not there? It's decontextualized, and that decontextualization makes a huge difference in the register that you need to use. And we all operate in multiple registers. But so partly it's a question of this issue of what registers are people bringing into classrooms, or bringing into learning situations, or bringing into job interviews, and sort of differentiating what register is going to work in a particular context.
Which David are you referring to?
David Olson, Olson. I don't know if he's still there, but he was at Toronto for the longest time. I think he's probably still there. But, I mean, some of the stuff is pretty, quote, old, but, you know, old is not always bad. But I think it'll give you some background on kind of the way people think about the differences between oral and written language, which has huge implications for how you even approach it, and how you move kids from what they can talk about and think about into expressing it in a way that when others read it, they're going to get what people are thinking. It's really complicated.
So, I mean, repairing feedback obviously like happens sort of in many more contexts besides like language usage. And I wasn't sure how you thought, like what you've said here applies, you know, in other contexts. So like, you know, like science concepts or like
strategies.
Yeah, like, you know, is there something specific about language where repair here really requires the solidarity, or is it like a sort of general point about that when you're offering corrective, you know?
I think it's general.
Yeah.
I think it can be applied to strategies, like I think in the math, I didn't get to go into the math article too much, but that one is more about problem-solving strategies. So you could have a whole range of corrective feedback. So I do focus on like the linguistic correction of linguistic form, but I think you could also look at how strategies are corrected, or how content is corrected. You know, all those kinds of things. And I don't think those are really different in terms of the issue of confianza and solidarity and all that kind of stuff. So I think that when you're looking at, corrective feedback is coming from the written tradition, and repair comes from the oral tradition. And so when you look at these two together, it's supposed to be talking about both. And in the examples I gave, there is some writing going on, and some of them are happening in the oral space of the class, and especially with the author's chair, that was writing that was being corrected. So to me, while there is a difference between oral language and writing, they're still both meaning-making tools. They're still semiotic practices. So when I look at them as semiotic practices, and in that includes oral, verbal, nonverbal, written, and visual, right? Visual images. So all of these ways of making meaning are included in how we interact and achieve greater levels of intersubjectivity and things like that. So we're always trying to make sense through correction or through feedback, right? And that's the necessary loop in meaning making, especially when the meaning making is, there's no intersubjectivity. Whenever we hit those moments of tension in meaning making, then we have to, call upon either repair practice or corrective practice or, something of that sort. It doesn't matter what it is, if it's writing, oral, visual, I think you probably have the same principle in terms of like that solidarity being there, right?
Well, Bo, please join me again in thanking Aria for coming.
All right, thank you.